Great. Thanks. So we have, I think, about 10 minutes or so for questions. Anybody have any questions for our panel? Can't believe we've stunned you into silence. Yeah.
I have a question for Melisande. So you talked about metadata, and I'm from the library world,
Yes.
so it sounds as though each publisher has its own controlled vocabulary. There is no standardization, is that correct?
I think that's true for many publishers who have that level. And I also think it's true, if anybody here works with NISO on this issue, they'll know more than me, and please join in. But I do think that NISO is establishing a global taxonomy by subject, but that's a huge undertaking. You know, and I think back to my years working with BISAC codes, where you could have these nestled words where you might have history, and then you'd have European history, then you'd have German history, then you'd have Berlin history. Those nestled words, that came up from one industry standard. But I think that NISO is establishing that. But there are, I do know, I wasn't joking, a few publishers do have their own taxonomists, and they are establishing their own vocabulary. And that, you raise a good point, sorry if I'm going on a little bit longer. The publishers who depend on authors to share, create keywords, there's a plus and a minus to that. The authors are the closest to that data. But if you've just written a book and you've come up with a new theory and you've created a new phrase to describe that theory, and that's what you make into all your keywords, the theory might not have circulated that much outside of your 12 friends. And so that means it's not going to be as searchable as you think it could be, because someone who wants that same idea but doesn't yet know that phrase might not come across the book. So your point about who is creating the guidelines for the vocabulary is really a great one. I don't believe I answered it. I've just complicated it more, though.
Well, it does sound like we're at kind of a crossroads with all of this, from the library perspective, sounds like from the publishing perspective, because those keywords are truly key in getting the information out. And you talked about the discoverable platforms that libraries have. Those are very limited.
Yeah.
So, I mean, the hope that somehow you're going to find your book in there might be slim to none, because we're really looking at journals for those discoverability platforms. So, I mean, it's thinking about how we can pull the control vocabulary from the library side of things, Library of Congress, for example, and I'm not familiar with these, though, so maybe that is what's happening, but it does sound a bit glacial.
I think you're right, and I think that definitely touches on what Yasmin was saying about open access titles being difficult for folks to find. I think I would make that larger. Just books actually are very difficult to find in these systems. Yeah.
Yeah.
I'll project. So I don't have this directed to any one of you, so please, anyone chime in. But so I work for a publishing company. I work for Wiley, and I think a big question we're grappling with is the format the books need to take: PDF, full text, HTML, EPUB, right? In an online manner. Because even if your metadata is great, you have keywords and all that, in my opinion, you need to go further, right? So I think some publishers are saying they're going to go EPUB is kind of the standard, and possibly even across journals. But what's everyone's kind of take on what's the recommended path? Where do we see the future going with how book content should be made alive online? Have I stumped you? It's a hard question.
I think we stick to all three.
You stick to all three. Well, that can be expensive, right?
No.
Yeah.
Should we use the microphone?
I think HTML as source supports all of those, because EPUB is nothing more than HTML in a wrapper. HTML is HTML for the other source file format. And going from HTML to book formatted PDF or just any kind of PDF is actually pretty interesting these days, with renderers like Prince ML or Vivleo style. So I think if you can go to HTML as the source file format, then pretty much for free you can get to EPUB. You can maintain your HTML source file format, and you can get to PDF. So yeah, so I think the big question here is getting into HTML as a source file format for books.
Totally agree with that. I think it's actually big thing we like to think about is, should journals content and book content live homogeneously together, right, when you're doing a search experience, or should they almost visually be treated differently, right? So I think that's the big thing too, that I think when we're talking about user experience of book content versus journal content, or MRWs, anything you can imagine, right? So I think to me that's the question too, is how do we think that this is going to go with the actual rendering as a customer experience, how the content's delivered.
We'll be talking a little bit about that in the second half of this.
All right?
I can say something about that. Yeah.
Science versus genetics.
Right,
Well, I can pick some of that.
right.
Yeah.
I have any questions you want?
No, I want to comment on that. I think the difference between journals and books is that books have a much longer shelf life. And so if you put them side by side with journal articles and treat them in the same way, then you're underestimating books. So a book that is 5 years old is still very relevant. I can show you many examples where a book is being cited, you see the citation graph of a book still going up after 25 years. And so it still makes sense to promote that book, which seems like selling old stuff, but it's not, because people still cite it. So I think you need at least a slightly different approach for books than for journals.
That's the interpretation, not necessarily the user experience itself. You just need to be aware that you can't compare usage similarly, but the experience of a user in a book versus a journal, if they're a researcher looking for an answer to their question, surely that needs to be more similar?
It depends what he's looking for, really. I mean, if you're looking for the latest news, then you tend to go to an article. If you want to set up a new research line, you're more likely looking for a book, at least in let's say, the life science, biomedical, that direction. And so, yeah.
So, can I take a different direction?
Yeah.
A different question. I had a question for Marcel, although it's really related to the ebook discoverability piece as well. So you have open access books on Knowledge Unlatched, and you're looking at a lot of detail about where they're being used and when and those kinds of things. And I think it's really a powerful thing to be able to do that on a global basis. I'm wondering if you or if anybody else has been thinking, especially in the open access book world, has been thinking about using linked data and triples, which were sort of maybe again at the beginning or the end of the middle of a 20-year revolution. I mean, linked data as an idea has been around forever, but it is starting to come out and basically taking metadata about books, reformatting it in such a way that it's easily crunched and fed into by Google. Google loves to go through and use that data structure in that way to make it available in web search engines. So this is a big discussion in library land right now. It is definitely becoming things that we're hearing from publishers, certainly Springer Nature being one of them. Hey, this is a new thing, we need to do this. But for me, with electronic resources, you get in the trouble of, well, wait, will I have access to that or not? And with open access books, you don't have that problem. So I wonder if you've thought about linked data and whether it might really expose and increase your usage. And because you have this history of looking at how much usage is going on, if you try to link data and see if that makes any difference in a particular context, you could probably do a natural experiment where you could measure that. So I guess the bigger picture question is anybody thinking about linked data as a way to increase their ebook discoverability? And have you thought about that particularly at Knowledge Unlatched?
So particularly at Knowledge Unlatched, we are at the moment not working with this. We try to experiment with the geolocation data and try to go on from there and enrich the data we have there. And as I said, like combine it with other data so that we have enriched data on this. So we've not worked with linked data on this space so far.
Right, but it's on the use side. This would be the promoting use side.
Yeah.
Sorry.
I was just going to say, one of our big achievements was getting Knowledge Unlatched books and the away from digital library indexed by Google Scholar. So it's actually apparently one of the issues with Google Scholar and indexing a lot of books was tables, and Google Scholar are now indexing open access books by away from. Is that helpful?
Yeah, it's a step in the right direction.
But
a lot of university libraries and public libraries are taking their print book collections, transforming their catalog mark record data into this linked data, and exposing it to Google that then crunches it, and then allowing local context searches and basically people just using the open web finding that content. So I think open access ebooks should think beyond the library catalog, beyond Google Scholar and Google Books, into that, what the linked data possibilities are. There are companies out there working on this right now. It makes sense while watching what usage is. It's somewhat limited. What our big problem in ebooks, I think, has always been discoverability, still is. Since this it seems like open access ebooks and a potential tool that can allow much better discoverability of ebooks go together in ways that they can't necessarily have an application for books that you have to pay, ebooks that you have to pay to access. So that's my suggestion.
We probably have time for one more question if there is one. Yeah.
I was just going to say, I think also in response to your point, I think there's about 9 or 10 book production systems out there that support HTML as source, which allow you to go out to HTML and debug. And so it might be interesting to look at those, because getting to those formats is pretty cheap, and discoverability is already inherent within HTML because it's part of the lingua franca of the web.
Okay, so we're going to take a break now for half an hour. We will make sure there are seats for everybody when you get back. I'm sorry for some of you been standing the whole time. We'll make sure there's enough seats for everybody, and we're going to hand over to Alex Humphreys from JSTOR, who's going to get you working after the break. But in the meantime, just thank you to all the speakers so far.